Bachmann is best known for its trains, but was actually involved in several different industries. In the mid-60s, the company introduced its N-scale line of products, and then in the 70s came out with what it's best known today, its HO-scale line of products. The company continued to retool and adjust its lines of products straight through the 70s, but times they were a-changing. Model railroading was going through a phase in which it wasn't as popular as it used to be, having to compete with video games. While the video game crash of the 1980s would certainly change fortunes back in the direction of model railroading, at least for a time, this would come far too late to save Bachmann from being acquired, as it was sold in 1981 to the Kadar Group. Based in China, the company would promptly rename Bachmann Trains to Bachmann Industries, then drastically retool the entire HO-scale product line with a focus on low production costs at the expense of quality. To start with, the tooling was drastically reworked for all these locomotives to make them far less costly to produce. This allowed the company to have far less overhead and make a higher profit off of each of its models. Now, while it is true that the whole industry on its own was cutting corners everywhere possible to reduce overhead to thus increase profit margins, Bachmann kind of did this right. As we can see with this example of a chassis system F9 unit, which I actually owned and ran when I was a kid several years ago on my layout before DCC, the locomotive itself looks almost identical to the previous production models, as we saw earlier. But if we take the lid off, we can see things aren't all what they seem. Much like Lifelike's products, the shells can be swapped between the two chassis. As we can see, the locomotive features the standard ringworm motor that was seemingly populating the entire industry at this point with a few exceptions. Now, while these were very infamous and known for causing problems, Bachmann sort of did things right, which allowed them to get away with cutting some corners. To start with, they would manufacture their gearing and other mechanisms with much thicker plastic. While the gears themselves would be known to crack, the mechanisms themselves, the shell, etc., would be much stronger. This would allow them to withstand most force and at least run for a good period of time. The windings, commutator, and other such internal components were made of higher quality materials and properly balanced. The end results are very noticeable. In addition to that, as we saw before, these locomotives featured nickel-silver wheels on all of the trucks, and they all were pickups with the exception of the two with the traction tires on them. This is a huge upgrade compared to as we see with the Lifelike unit above, which features a much more basic electrical system with a single truck pickup that doesn't even have nickel-silver wheels. In fact, it uses brass wheels. Further aggravating the situation is that not only are the wheels on the power truck not pickups, but they're actually composed of plastic wheels with rubber traction tires. The end result of all this cost cutting was, well, erratic and just downright atrocious performance. The end result is a very reluctant runner of a locomotive that will not do anything unless coaxed along by its very much frustrated owner. And while it was true that the Bachmann motors weren't the greatest thing, even if they were manufactured to a slightly higher standard, Bachmann had you covered there too. Unlike the Lifelike locomotive we're looking at the top with its disassembled and destroyed motor, which actually was shipped like that, Bachmann locomotives of this era came with a lifetime limited warranty. If anything ever went wrong with the locomotive, you just sent it back to Bachmann and they'd repair it for you. Pretty shocking in this day and age, and the reason why Bachmann was able to get away with this for the most part is that these trains had become more a throwaway item, and the society in general itself was turning to a throwaway society, meaning if something broke, why fix it? Just get a new one. Most hobbyists at the time would simply choose to do just that. Speaking of throwaway items, Tyco's infamous Power Torque brown box items of the day were often broken right out of the box and lacked almost any customer service for the customers who had the misfortune of buying one of these items that did malfunction. Most of these simply got returned, so it's not hard to see how Bachmann was able to start building up a bit of a fanfare despite its lower quality products. And to the company's credit, and I'd say this cringingly, the company didn't stand still. They continued to upgrade their models. Here we have a model that was introduced around the early 90s. It looks similar to what Bachmann had before, but if we look very carefully, we see that a lot has changed. To start with, the unit, while it again has all-wheel pickup, it now features a basic and somewhat crude, but still capable all-wheel drive system. The motor itself is manufactured to something resembling a quality standard, but it isn't the highest quality thing in the world. Still, the main advantage, it doesn't cost much to get hold of, and after all, if it breaks, no big deal. Just get another one. Also note that the rear gears do not have covers on them, another cost-cutting measure, and I should also mention that the wheel pickup system on this particular locomotive is done with wheel wipers, not axle bearings. This essentially is the theme here. The products have perceived value for money, but are essentially dishonest products. as they look and are promoted to be actually much better than they actually are. The quality concerns only begin to appear as the locomotive begins to age. And now we come to the main subject of this review, the Bachmann RF Sharp in D&H paint scheme. And taking a look at it from the box, well, I have to admit, again, the colors and vibrancy of this model kind of grab your attention, grab you by the neck, I should say, and force you to pay attention. The box itself kind of shows the low-endness of this whole product, gives basic information about it, but isn't anything fancy. Cheap plastic with cheap cardboard. We'll get more into that later on as I open the package up and pull this engine out. I should also note, as you see in the box, this is in fact a DCC equipped model. I should also point out that this model is in fact 10 years old, but has never been taken out of its box as far as I know. First impressions are actually quite good, especially the beautifully shaped nose. The paint sticks out like a sore thumb as being very attractive to look at. The gold stripe is there. Every little of the vibrant details kind of stick out. Note the fine detailing like the windshield wipers and that impressive gold Delaware and Hudson shield, which is also the logo for the company, and the nice gold trim all around the locomotive. The unit is also equipped with knuckle couplers, and they are the Mark II type couplers that feature a spring to help hold the knuckles shut. They do not utilize a piece of plastic to hold the knuckles shut like on the Mark I type couplers. Then, as we start to take a closer look, we begin to see where things aren't quite all as they seem. The detailing, while it may look attractive, has some weird quirks to it. The rivets are all in place, but they're kind of molded into the shell, and while all the blackened out grills are all a nice little effect, well, the fact is they are not separately applied, and they really don't show themselves to be very good. The trucks themselves, including the brake cylinders, are all molded in plastic pieces, one piece, nothing here separately applied. While some would argue that this makes the locomotive less intimidating to work on and to handle, the fact is it gives it a more 2D look. Disassembling the locomotive is pretty simple. We just need a Phillips head screwdriver. We need to remove the fuel tank on the bottom to give us better access to the screws that actually hold the shell in place. With the two screws removed, the fuel tank can simply be pulled off. With the fuel tank removed, we can now see the 4 small screws we need to remove to get the shell off. In this case with a skinny neck screwdriver so we can reach down and reach the screw head itself. And I must admit, even with this screwdriver, it was very tricky to get access. Once all 4 screws are removed, we can gently remove the shell from the top of the locomotive. Once the shell is off, we're greeted with the sight of a very basic electronic circuit board for this particular locomotive. Again, this unit has DCC on board, and so the board has that integrated nicely in it. It's important to note that earlier models of DCC-equipped units from Bachmann just had an H-pin plug with an EC command-style decoder plugged into them. The board itself, even for an engine from this era, is long overdue for a die shrink. This is to say, shrinking the total nanometers the processor and chips occupy. Reducing the nanometers in size reduces power consumption and thus heat production, something that's a very good idea around models made of plastic. There's also a small LED light in the front. I must admit this would not prove to be the strongest one I've ever seen in my life. To get this board off, we're going to remove just a few screws. With the screws out, we simply unwrap the wires to release the board itself. As we see under the hood, Bachmann did do some upgrades to this motor. It actually has a flywheel in place, although that's pretty much the extent of it. It still lacks any kind of worm gear housing. Apparently the idea is to have the metal act as one around the gear area. The drive shafts are also composed of that cheap plastic that Bachmann seems to be obsessed with. Now let's get her back together so we can continue our tour of the internal components of this locomotive. Let's take a look at the internals of the trucks themselves. To get access, we need a flathead screwdriver, a lot of patience and courage, as well as persistence. With all of that, the truck cover finally comes off, and we can take a good look at the internals of the trucks. As we see, they don't have bearings, they're just held in place by a plastic snap. This again would affect the longevity of the model, and once again there are the infamous wheel wipers picking up power, not the axle bearing system, because of course this unit again doesn't have bearings. Again, the lack of wheel bearings and the utilization of wheel wipers will mean more parts that will need to get replaced probably sooner rather than later on these models as they age. In the case of the wheel wipers, it's because they come out of shape, and in the case of the bearings, it's because the wheels will literally wear through the plastic. There is no metal bearing to guide them as they turn. The gears are the infamous white plastic gears that have a terrible reputation for cracking, breaking, and basically messing up drivetrains on these engines. As we see, the truck covers simply snap right back into place. Looking inside the box, we see another way in which these models have changed since the 80s. Gone is the lifetime limited warranty, replaced with a single 1-year warranty, which I'm pretty sure this locomotive, considering all the time it sat on the shelf before I acquired it, which was a few years ago in itself, is long since past. There's also a notice inside the box confirming that the Bachmann DCC decoder installed actually conforms to all NMRA standards as well as FCC requirements. We also get some propaganda, if you will, from Bachmann about the features of the DCC decoder installed on this locomotive. There's also a detailed blueprint/parts diagram that comes along with the package, showing you all the parts of the locomotive and what numbers they correspond to in case you need to order something to repair it, which is more likely than not, considering the quality this locomotive is built to. Now let's get this unit on the tracks and see how she runs. As we can see by this footage, the locomotive was a very timid runner out of the box. Admittedly, it had sat around for a while, but that doesn't excuse all of the issues I ran into. Note the loud hum the locomotive makes whenever a command is issued to make the locomotive move. This is a trademark of the inexpensive and outdated decoder that was utilized in this locomotive from the factory. After running the locomotive back and forth a few times and letting the motors warm up, if you will, it began to perform better. It continued the annoying humming noise whenever power was applied to it, something that would not be acceptable these days in DCC decoders, and was technically not going to really cut the mustard even in the days when this locomotive was initially released. Please also note how weak the front LED light is. While it is supposed to light up both the number boards and the headlight, you can just barely tell it's on, let alone produce any light to actually light the area in front of the locomotive as it runs down the tracks. And even with the warm-up, the engine still managed to find every chance to stall out on me. I should note that the quality of this decoder in general is pretty poor. I've seen a lot of these locomotives fail to operate out of the box until either a CV8 reset was performed or until the board itself was actually replaced. Finally, after much coaxing, I finally managed to get the locomotive out of my yard, although even then, as you can see, it wasn't so happy taking commands from the DCC system. We can again see just how pathetic that LED light really is. After the locomotive made several more laps than are shown in this video, it began to run much better, as we'll see as I now back it back into my yard. Note the locomotive's new ability to crawl nice and slow, but also note the humming, which is quite annoying from the decoder itself. While the humming persisted, the exercise and running the train around the track and back and forth a few times certainly helped the engine's ability to run in general. But as we see, even with this exercise, the locomotive still managed to stall every so often. This would be somewhat acceptable from a sound-equipped engine considering all the power they're drawing, but not from a silent DCC decoder that is only supplying commands to make the locomotive move back and forth and switch on the lights. I then tried another experiment. I decided to let the engine sit overnight and then run it the next morning. Sure enough, I was right. While not as prominent, the stuttering and stalling did return. And now with all my nitpickings, it's time for me to give you my verdict on this particular model. It's very deceptive and seductive. Once you lay eyes on it, you think you've got to have it, especially with the beautiful detailing around the nose, etc. It seems to go out of its way to convey a sense that it's actually better quality than it actually is. Add the low price of somewhere around $50 to $60, and the fact that it is equipped with DCC for that low price, and you think, hey, I'll take it. It can't be that bad, right? Right? Wrong. The fact of the matter is this locomotive has every possible corner cut to keep the prices down on it, and while the unit will run for a while, like many a cheap product, it's not going to last forever before it needs major work. And while it may certainly cost less than its competition, we have to also remember that you'll have to spend money to keep it going, and reliability issues due to its cheap parts will become more and more of an issue as it ages, especially in relation to those more expensive models. So any advantage of buying this as opposed to its expensive competition are pretty much outweighed right then and there. Bottom line, I would avoid this locomotive unless of course you're given it as a present, and or unless you pretty much have it given to you at a hobby shop or train fair by someone desperate enough to get rid of it. Just be forewarned, you're not buying a top quality product, you're buying something that will most likely cause headaches later on. And that'll do it for this review, folks. If you enjoyed my review and liked it, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. If not, thumbs down, and please subscribe to the channel. Thank you again, and have a pleasant evening, and once again, folks, keep the metal side that is your wheels down on the track.